And hello everyone, it's Robert here, and today on my channel something very special. I am going to attempt to tell you about every tarot book I have. That's 31 books. I will try to split it into categories to some degree. But one easy category to go for would be books about Pamela Colman Smith. Unfortunately, this category includes probably the two worst books in my collection. Also, maybe two of the worst books I've ever read. So you may have to put up with me being a bit negative at the beginning of the video. But as we get going, I'll be telling you about lots of books that I do really like very much and that I do recommend. So the first section will be books about Pamela Colman Smith. We'll start with the best one. This is Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. And it says it's by Stuart Kaplan with Mary K. Greer, Elizabeth Foley O'Connor and Melinda Boyd Parsons. That's a little naughty. It's by all four of those, but because Stuart R. Kaplan, I think, made his collection of Pamela Abelia available, and because he's really the publisher, I suppose, he's put his name as the author, with the other ones just as also Rans. It's an exciting book because really it's just a glorious sort of catalogue showing Stuart R. Kaplan's amazing collection of Pamela's stuff. And really, I think that's the best way to take it. It's not cheap. It's a great big book, but it's nicely printed, it's nicely produced. And it is recommended up to a certain point. I think you could give it to someone as a present and they would be absolutely delighted. I don't really recommend any of the text. It's disappointing in the way that tarot writing can be disappointing. You know, you've got these eminence griseurs, these tarot experts, and to some extent Pamela Colman Smith experts, you know, presenting this substantial doorstop of a volume, and you're hoping that you're going to have a good fun time with it and learn some new stuff and read some lively writing. But alas, not really. There is information there is good research in there, but it's not written in a very lively manner. And as I've pointed out, I have reviewed this book separately. The section by Mary K. Greer at the end, Pamela's Legacy, which I was excited to read, is disappointing and problematic, as they say in universities, in that, you know, Mary K. Greer is obviously one of the queens of tarot, and one would hope that she would be like, that she would present a lavish and fabulous and exciting picture of Pamela, but I found her portrait of Pamela rather reductive. I found that she wasn't particularly complimentary about Pamela, not enough for my taste. I don't think she really recognises the genius of Pamela Colman Smith. That's a slight quibble, and I think this, you know, if you're a Pamela fan, and maybe if someone wants to buy you a Christmas present, then you would be very happy to find this squeezed into your Christmas stocking. But don't get your hopes up too high. Now, it's my painful duty to review two more. We've got Pamela Colman Smith, Tarot Artist, The Pious Pixie by Dawn G. Robinson. This is a very, very strange book. I've been reading it for several years now, and I'm on page 177. Because, and I'm almost at the end now, I'm doing very well, but because it's written in such a bizarre style that it's almost unreadable, that the words swim in front of one's eyes. And I've read some fairly bizarre and unreadable things in my time. I thought at one point it had been written by an AI, but it was written, I think, before AI came sweeping into view. It doesn't really seem to have any feeling of coherence as a piece of writing. There's quite a lot of research in it, and much of this research not very interesting. And as I've pointed out in my review of this book, it feels like it was written by someone who doesn't even specialise in tarot and doesn't really know very much about tarot. The author, for example, seems not to know what the Tarot de Marseille is, and makes some very odd comments about, how much a Tarot de Marseille might cost if you wanted to buy one. It seems that this author went to live in Pamela's area or Pamela's hometown and stumbled upon her as a piece of local colour, a local historical figure, and decided to do some research and write a book. And that leads to a very disappointing book. Apart from the extreme weirdness of the writing, the perspective is just insanely exasperating if you're into tarot, because this author spends pages and pages and pages and pages talking about Pamela's retirement, in which really nothing happened except that she looked after the local Roman Catholic chapel and wrote letters to the bishop saying, please, can we have some money? And the bishop ignored her. And that's why I kind of gave up at page 177, because it became apparent that I wasn't really going to learn anything more that was remotely interesting about Pamela Colman Smith. So, this is a book that you will find on the shelf in esoteric bookshops. And I think in my humble opinion, it's a testament to how underexplored this story is by scholars and writers, and more importantly by tarot enthusiasts. I think this is a very strange book. Third up in my Pamela Colman Smith section, this is Queen of Wands, a sort of a comic strip biography of Pamela by a lady called Kat Willett, and I've had a lot of fun complaining about this book. I think I've done it 2 or 3 times. It's nul point as far as I can see. It's very inaccurate historically speaking, and it's written from a very tiresome sort of revisionist, how can I put this, sort of paranoid feminist point of view. I'm not against feminism, but I am against paranoia, in which, the whole of human history was the handmaid's tale. It was just men abusing women for thousands of years. And so this forces her to paint a picture of Pamela's life, which is one-sided, to put it politely. And, we like Pamela because she was the co-creator of the Waite-Smith deck. And in a sense, the agenda of this book is to tell, I suppose, young women in, jaunty comic strip form that Pamela wasn't the co-creator of the RWS, she was the sole creator, and A.E. Waite just sat in the background being patriarchal and just taking the piss and then running off with all the cash. And that is not really true. And so, we move swiftly on. If you want to hear me complain about this book at greater length and with greater relish, just look at my book review playlist. Okay, next up, something a bit more positive. There was a time when I realised that there was a gap in my knowledge, and it was to do with the court cards. I actually have a theory that there's a gap in most people's knowledge about the court cards. I think they're not very well understood. That's a different topic. I have released videos about the court cards, but I was reading this and reading that, and I came across this lovely, jubbly book. It is Studies on Mystical Tarot, The Court Cards by Yolanda M. Robinson. It's tiny. Look, it's very, very slim. It's less than 100 pages long. And what can I say about this book? It's rather specialised. It's brainy, but not so brainy that it's not fun. It's written by a very expert tarotiste. It comes from a Kabbalistic point of view, as much tarot writing does. Now, that, normally speaking, would kind of count me out, because I'm not a Kabbalist and I don't resonate with it, and I don't enjoy looking at things in a Kabbalistic way. However, the reason why I found this book so good, I mean, Yolanda Robinson is a great writer, has a wonderful sort of, a wonderful, how can I put this? Some people's brains are just so function in such a way that is inspiring, and you feel yourself becoming more intelligent as you read such writers, and Yolanda Robinson's one of these people, she has a website as well, and she says some amazing things. She just throws away comments about tarot that you think, ooh, ooh, ooh. She talks about the chaos that is unleashed by the fall of the cards on the table. So definitely my kind of writer. And what's great about this book is it's not so much about Kabbalah. It's more about the Rider-Waite-Smith. And she occasionally gives you pictures of the builders of the Aditum Tarot, I think that is, which, as you know, is similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith. But she concentrates on the Rider-Waite-Smith. And the way that she looks at Pamela's designs of the Rider-Waite-Smith is very holistic, very clever, very well informed, and basically genius. Yeah, I've given this book a full review on its own, but she's particularly good about the pages, for example. Some tarot writers have very little to say about the pages. She talks about how one page in the sequence kind of like leads to the next. So we go page of wands, page of cups, page of swords, page of pentacles. And she talks about how the energy of the page of cups sort of gracefully gives birth to the energy of the page of swords. And she talks about how in the page of swords there are birds flying overhead, and these birds actually form the shape of the fish. And it's very clear when you look at it, that's exactly right. I don't know of any other tarot writer who's noticed that. And you get the impression that these are her observations. They're not things that she read in books. And she says, look, we've gone from the page of cups, fish coming out of the cup, to page of swords, birds in the sky. But for a moment, they form the shape of a fish, as if linking us to page of cups. So, the unformed material of the unconscious in page of cups develops into the formed thoughts and ideas and beliefs in page of swords. So you have unconsciousness to thought. Just an example of how brilliant she is. And it's just a very poetic book. And it did maybe more than any other book, with maybe the possible exception of Paul Huson's work, to give me a grip on the court cards. I got excited and I bought another book by Yolanda M. Robinson, which is here, the new revised art tarot. And she's talking about the Knapp Hall Tarot. She says mysticism and Kabbalah in the Knapp Hall Tarot. And I've read half of this book, but then again, my admiration and my love of Yolanda M. Robinson's writing wasn't quite enough to sustain me through a Kabbalistic project, I suppose you'd call it. But it's there, I believe those are her only two books, but a very interesting writer. And you can see her talking and giving lectures and things on YouTube. While we're on the subject of court cards, I also bought this Understanding the Tarot Court by Mary K. Greer and Tom Little. Now, second little bash of Mary K. Greer here. She's a lovely woman, and she actually has corresponded with me on Facebook about a question that I raised about this book. But I don't think overall it is a very, very good book. I think the problem with tarot is that it's a bit amorphous, and what one is craving is sort of a sense of focus. One actually wants, in a sense, fewer, better, more focused, more helpful ideas, rather than to be flooded with 1,000 ideas. And this book, it just floods you with ideas about the court cards. And it also dives into the vexed question of the difference between the RWS system and Crowley's Thoth system. And she talks about the background of that split and what the Golden Dawn were thinking about, kings and queens and knights and pages, and what elements they represented and how they corresponded with the zodiac and with the Kabbalah and so forth. And it's not particularly clearly done. And I concentrated quite hard reading this book, and there was a certain point where I felt it was just creating more confusion than it was clearing up. So, not really for that one. Okay, from something lovely to something less lovely. Here we have the Book of Thoth, and there's some background to me and the Book of Thoth. When I first made a video about tarot books I don't like, I think about 2 years ago, I included the Book of Thoth, tarot books I don't recommend. And this quite rightly led to me being told off by a Crowley expert who said, before you mouth off about the Book of Thoth, you should think about it. Go home and think about it. Do some more research. Stop being so superficial. And this kind of cut me to the quick because it was kind of true. I was being a bit superficial. I mean, I am a superficial person in some ways. Being superficial is not always a bad thing if you can be intuitive at the same time. And I tend to have a fairly good idea of how I feel about a writer or a thinker fairly early on. But that is no excuse for ignorance and for not doing the research. And clearly, knowledge is better than ignorance. So because I was finding this book fairly difficult going, well, extremely difficult going, but with qualifications that there are certain things in this book you can dive in and you can get very interesting things out of this book, but it's very difficult to read from cover to cover. And because I was kind of struggling, I thought, okay, I'll be good, I'll do some Crowley research. And so I've got 2 Aleister Crowley biographies in my collection. And I think this is relevant to tarot because clearly Crowley as a figure looms very large in the history of tarot and indeed the legacy of tarot because of the Thoth tarot. So the first book I read, unfortunately, was this one. Aleister Crowley, The Biography, Spiritual Revolutionary, Romantic Explorer, Occult Master, and Spy by Tobias Churton. And, Tobias Churton is clearly clever, well-informed, cultured, and literate. But I don't think this is a very good biography. And I'll tell you why. After finishing that, I felt, oh, am I just too stupid? Was it just my fault for not being able to keep up with all this Crowley stuff? And so a friend online, a subscriber, said, no, there's another one, this one. Do What Thou Wilt by Lawrence Sutin, A Life of Aleister Crowley. And my friend said, look, read that one, that's much better. So I read this one, understood every word, enjoyed it, and really got to grips with Crowley. And then I realised that it wasn't my fault that I hadn't really been able to keep up with this one, because I think the job of a biographer is to lead one through the jungle of facts, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone's life has 32 billion facts in it. We don't want them all in a biography because we need someone to help us to understand a kind of like a line going through the biography. And this book is much better for that. Both books, to some extent, are what they call apologies for Aleister Crowley. In other words, an explanation of the man and the reason why he did what he did and was how he was. This book is a little bit too far towards the fan literature. In other words, it's like Crowley was always right and everyone else was always wrong to be so unfair to him. This book is much more interesting because it explains why people were wary of him, and it gives examples of, for example, Crowley sort of willfully alienating people who liked him and wanted to help him, and kind of like, what's the word? There's a little bit of the Oscar Wilde there. It's Crowley against the whole world. A little bit of the martyr complex, that he brought down ruin upon himself just again and again and again. He really made He made an art form of it, I think. Doesn't get away from the fact that this is a very interesting person. Doesn't get away from the fact that this is someone whose life and whose thought and whose work has changed human culture, has changed the way we feel about, the way we think about spirituality, and has changed the way we think and feel about things like magic and tarot and so forth. The other proviso in all this is that I'm not into magic at all. I'm into lots of things. I'm into lots of spooky things. I find there are people who have very interesting things to say about the other dimensions. There's Jane Roberts with her Seth books. These days there's Matthias de Stefano with his Memories of Atlantis, and he's a really interesting guy. But I'm not drawn to magic. I'm not part of the magic community. I don't read up about magic. It's just not my thing. So, with Crowley you have someone whose thing definitely was magic, and you have to deal with that. Getting on to Book of Thoth, and to any outraged Crowley fans, I'm going to come clean and say, even though I've dotted around the book, in terms of reading it from cover to cover, I'm on page 143 of, about 220 pages. So I'm way over halfway through, but it's taking me a long time, and I cannot read it every day because, frankly, for my limited intellectual capacities, it is constantly skating along the borderline of being unreadable. And I think, I admit to the limits of my brain and the limits of my esoteric knowledge and the limits of the amount of time I have spent researching esoteric things. Fine. I also suspect there is an element of gaslighting in Aleister Crowley because there are some passages which just sound so pompous and so silly that you get the impression that quite a lot of it is self-aggrandizement. Now, also within all this silliness and self-aggrandizement and deliberate obfuscation, which I think is an Age of Pisces thing, you get someone who was making incredible connections and was having incredible insights and was, clearly to some extent in touch with the other dimensions. So it's a really difficult book to have an opinion on. Something does occur to me, though, which I would like to say about Crowley's work and the Book of Thoth. This guy, Churton, says that Crowley's a great poet, greatest poet since William Blake. I have yet to read a poem by Crowley which I consider to be much good. I think he was a very conservative, stylistically a very conservative poet. He thought modernism was kind of like, was gay stuff. Fine. His father told him to read Shakespeare and read the King James Bible, which I think is great advice. I think Shakespeare and the King James Bible are, the heart of English literature. And, it's difficult to live in the modern world and write well because there is a lot of trash in modernity, isn't there? But I do think maybe one of the issues with Crowley is that he approached life partly from a literary point of view. He was into action, he was into climbing Mount Everest, he was into trekking across the wilderness of China, he was into strange sex magic rituals. He was into a lot of quite proactive things. But when he sat down to write, I think he got caught up in himself as a literary figure. So his instinct in writing is not always to communicate truths and insights, but it's to create, in a sense, literary beauty or literary effect. I'm trying to be nice here. And I think so what you have in Book of Thoth is to some extent a work of fiction. And it's not my favourite work of fiction, and so I will say no more than that for now. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, next section I would say is, let's say, vintage tarot works. As the B-52s would say, turn your watch back. About 100,000 years. But in this case, not 100,000 years. We could turn our watches back something like 100 years. I've got a copy of The Pictorial Key to the Tarot by A.E. Waite, and this came out with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and to some extent it was the book of the deck. So clearly it's an important sort of cornerstone of the tarot-verse. Now I would defend A.E. Waite as an important researcher and thinker and tarotist, and I'm thrilled that he collaborated with Pamela and that they created, the deck. But it is true that A.E. Waite's books are written in a very curmudgeonly style that you could call patriarchal if you wanted to, but I do find the book fairly unbearable and fairly unreadable. And what's really irritating about it is that he keeps implying that he's not telling you everything because you're just a member of the public. And if you want to learn everything, you have to join the Golden Dawn. So that's tiresome, isn't it? So he says, I could say more, but I'm not going to. And okay, well, there are secrets around this car, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. It's an important piece in the jigsaw, I think, in terms of researching how the Rider-Waite-Smith came about. You can look into this book, for example, and you can see that there's a sort of, you can see the split between A.E. Waite and Pamela. You can get a feeling, for example, that he was very involved in the Major Arcana, but less involved in the pip cards, for example. And that he maybe gave Pamela all the materials for creating the pip cards and then said, oh, get on with it, and maybe even lost interest a little bit, without really realizing that these illustrated pip cards were going to have such a world-changing effect. So you get descriptions of the pip cards in this book, which sometimes feel like he hasn't even looked at Pamela's pip cards. And you say, oh, and he says things like, oh, this card traditionally has two contradictory meanings which cannot be married. And then he just moves on. And then you look at what Pamela's done and you realize that she has actually taken the trouble to create an image that marries the two contradictory meanings. Like, for example, Five of Pentacles, it can mean companionship, it can mean hardship. And Pamela clearly managed to put that into the Five of Pentacles. So, yeah, I don't really recommend this as a book. I think there's much better ways of spending your time than ploughing through this. But it depends on I think it depends how you're wired. It depends on your tolerance for Edwardian, ponderous Edwardian, curmudgeonly academic or quasi-academic writing. If we turn our watch now forward to the 1970s, we come to Eden Gray. And I like buying old books. Look, it's an old book. It's an old book from the 70s and it's all yellow at the edges. And the thing about Eden Gray is that she was an early tarot popularizer in the post-war time. And she did a lot to make tarot the big deal that it is today. So the writing is interesting and careful and fun. Like the A.E. Waite book, I don't really recommend it. I think I can save you the trouble of reading this because it's old-fashioned. And you think, oh, the 70s weren't so far away. At least they're not for me. I remember the 70s. But it shows how quickly ideas change, and it shows how tarot has become more modern, and it shows how something like tarot, in a sense, because it is amorphous and because there is no rule book, it is constantly being rethought and reimagined, I suppose. And the rule books, such as they are, which don't exist, keep needing to be rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. To be specific, what you have in this book is that Eden Gray has rounded up traditional meanings, which incidentally is something that Paul Huson is going to do in a much more interesting way later. And she's kind of working on this project of getting tarot into a digestible form for the modern age. But it seems to me that it's sort of half digested. What do I mean by that? Well, she includes meanings in her book which are just unusable, which I actually think is a theme going through a lot of tarot writing, a huge amount of tarot writing. And this is actually, in a sense, one of my bugbears, one of my themes of my channel, is that I think huge amounts of tarot writing takes a view of tarot meanings which is too heavy and which in a sense is too traditional, because I think people were a bit heavier about divination in the old days. So as we progress, we need to lighten up and become more and more therapeutic and in a sense more and more positivistic when we use tarot. I don't think we can put down the tower every time we see the tower and go, oh my God, disaster, or every time we see the Ten of Swords, oh my God, ruin, it's all over. It's nonsense. Some of us want to read tarot every day, and if you do want to do that, you have to have lighter, easier meanings for all the cards. So in Eden Gray's book, you have, for example, Three of Swords. Danger of civil war is one of the meanings for the Three of Swords. And there are 4 of the pip cards in her meanings, which include the meaning possibility of an inheritance. And I think there's a 5th one, which says something like, the inheritance you're expecting could be bigger than you thought. And, you know, we just don't have time to be worrying about civil war or worrying about inheritances if we have a modern day-to-day tarot practice. But let's soldier on, and I want to talk about some vintage books. For a long time, this was the only tarot book I had, The Tarot by Alfred Douglas, and I had to re-buy it because my original edition, which I got in, end of the 70s, it kind of fell apart. This was published by Penguin, and then it's been republished by someone else. It's a classic. Alfred Douglas is a very interesting guy. I think he's still alive. He's fairly elderly now. And when he wrote this book, he wasn't entirely talking about the Rider-Waite-Smith, even though he is quite close to Waite and Smith in his take on the cards. He's kind of like an independent tarot expert. He's neither sort of a Marseille tarotist or an RWS tarotist. He's an indie, and he's connected to the tradition of magicians and esotericists of London, going right back to the Golden Dawn. He was taught by people who were taught by them. And for this book, he got his son-in-law to create a set of illustrations so that he didn't have to use Pamela's illustrations. And then I think after the book was published, the son-in-law's illustrations, David Sheridan, they were coloured in and released as a deck. And the deck's very interesting. It's light Rider-Waite-Smith and with a touch of Marseille here and there, and a few cards which really go their own way. Now, I think this book is quite good on the pip cards. I don't think it's terribly good on the courts or the major arcana, for reasons which I just mentioned. I find it's too heavy about major arcana, and I find the early chapters now, now that I'm a mature gentleman and I've lived my life and I've read the books, I find the early chapters not good, where he talks about history of tarot and the meaning of the major arcana as this kind of Jungian individuation journey. It's a bit forced. I think tarot is a bit more complex and also a bit simpler than that. I guess this book is from about 1970, and it feels like 1970. It hasn't dated all that well. It's still a classic, and as a reference book, have it as a reference book if you want. But I would direct you to the pip cards rather than to the other cards in the deck when it comes to meanings. Roughly contemporaneously with that, there was a book called The Devil's Picturebook by Paul Huson. Now, I think Paul Huson is, he seems to be similar generation to Alfred Douglas, maybe a couple of years younger, not sure. But, he was active at the same time. I think Paul Huson comes from England and then moved to the US. And Paul Huson is a very interesting writer. He's written a number of books about tarot and witchcraft and stuff like that. He's written fiction on various esoteric and magical themes, and he's also had a life as a screenwriter and a TV screenwriter. I think Devil's Picturebook was quite scandalous at the time because, and he also wrote a book about witchcraft, which was quite scandalous because his agenda in a sense was to respectabilize these rather either despised or feared things, like despised in the case of tarot and maybe feared in the case of witchcraft. And his agenda was to say, no, this is interesting, this is esoteric, it's cultural, it's got roots, it's got complexity. There's a lot we could say about this. So Devil's Picturebook came out around 1970, early 70s, and it purports to deal with the tarot. I recommend this book. I think it's really good, but I do have one observation about it, which is that it's not really about the tarot. It's about paganism and the old religion and the old gods and how they kind of feed into the tarot. But actually, I think the fact that he sells it as a book about tarot is a little bit of a marketing thing, because, you know, the Devil's Picturebook, what a great title, picture of the devil on the front, and then you get this sort of this promise of a rather racy book about this magic pack of cards. That's my only criticism of it, is that it's not really a tarot book, not 100%. But Paul Huson's a great writer, and this book hasn't really dated very much. I think it can stand up, and it's been reissued, and it's considered a lovely classic, and I recommend it too. I'm a Paul Huson fan, and I'm going to tell you more about Paul Huson. Paul Huson said that he was going to write an updated version of the Devil's Picturebook as we got into the 21st century. And as he sat down to plan that out, he realised that he didn't really want to write a new version, he wanted to write a new book. And what he wrote was this: Mystical Origins of the Tarot. This might be my top tip, ladies and gentlemen. In all my 31 books, if I had to boil it down to one, I might say this one. It's not perfect, it doesn't tell you everything, but useful. It is so useful, it's howlingly useful. It's a good overview of tarot history, which is a bit partisan, and there are some historians like Helen Farley who disagree with Paul Huson. But, you know, hear Paul Huson's side of the story. He's an esotericist. He's, I suppose, a magician. He believes in divination, unlike some tarot historians. So he's writing about tarot in a sense from the point of view, you know, of a believer in tarot's efficacy. But maybe more importantly, this book is a very, very good roundup of traditional tarot meanings. And so for each card, he will talk about 18th century meanings, 19th century meanings, 20th century meanings, and his own personal, I mean, I don't think his own personal suggestions are very good. He's talking about temperance, and one of his reverse meanings for temperance is anorexia. But anyway, whatever. You can hear what Kurt de Gébelin had to say about temperance. You can hear what Etala had to say about it. Levy, Christian, Mathers, The Golden Dawn, Grand Orient, Waite, who's also Grand Orient, and then Paul Huson himself. In other words, no more tears, ladies and gentlemen. There's no more stumbling about in the dark, trying to find out what the traditional meanings of the cards were. It's all here in one volume. It is very, very user-friendly. It clears up a lot of doubt. Also, when you read this book, you will realise the truth of what I have been saying, which is that tarot has to be modernised. It has to be modernised. It has to be modernised. We really cannot carry on taking tarot seriously if we're just going to tie ourselves down to the traditional meanings. Apart from anything else, they all contradict each other. So at some point in your tarot journey, hate that expression, if you're diving deeper and if you're reading widely, either you're going to become very confused about tarot meanings, or you're going to need a book like this, which will set it all down in black and white so that you can come to your conclusion about which meanings you're going to use. The other thing about Paul Huson is that he's very, 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 very good about the court cards. And there's two Paul Huson books, Mystical Origins of the Tarot and Dame Fortune's Wheel Tarot, a Pictorial Key. I'll come on to that later, but this book comes into its own very much about the court cards. This book is a kind of like a mini book of this book. You can have both, you don't need both. But Paul Huson points out that the playing cards, which, as you know, the playing card deck contains 12 court cards. And playing cards and tarot cards, as you probably know, are more or less contemporaneous, with playing cards arriving in Europe maybe 50 years before tarot. So tarot is like a kind of like a turbo version of playing cards. But it's quite clear from the research that playing cards also were used for divination, and playing cards accrued these traditional meanings. So the court cards in the playing card deck, the 12, which were kings, queens and jacks, which are really pages. There are no knights in the playing card deck. The playing cards accrued correspondences, and these correspondences corresponded to the worthies. That I think it was called the 12 worthies of medieval culture, and the 12 worthies were made up of biblical and classical figures. So you've got, and maybe medieval romance figures. So you've got things like King David, you've got Paris of Troy, you've got Charlemagne. For example, the King of Wands corresponds to Julius Caesar. The Queen of Swords corresponds to Pallas Athene. There's one of the kings corresponds to Charlemagne, and so forth. And I think that is howlingly interesting. And I think you can play with those traditional sort of popular culture meanings. You can import those into the tarot, and that's exactly what he does. So the knights don't get their ancient correspondences. There's no Greek mythology or biblical mythology attached to the 4 knights, but the other 12 do. And so this book is Paul Huson's personally designed and personally illustrated deck, Dame Fortune's Wheel, which I actually wouldn't use because it's so eccentric. But in this book, you get quite a lot of the same text, quite a lot of the same info that you got in this book, especially around the court cards. And you could just buy his deck in order to have his rather fabulous court cards, in which he just says, you know, King of Swords, and he just says, bold as brass, King David. So you get a court card and you get the mythological reference. Knave of Battens, Hector. Nothing for the knight, but Queen of Battens, Rachael, the biblical figure Rachael. King of Battens, Julius Caesar. So this is a lovely, lovely book to have, even though I don't think I'll be able to read with his deck, because lovely court cards, lovely majors, but his pip cards, he's just completely reinvented the pip cards. So you could buy his deck, buy the lovely book, and make it your only deck. But if you then were going to sit down with an RWS or a Marseille deck, I think you would get very confused. Okay, so I'm back. I've had my lunch. It's a marathon, and now it's going to start getting exciting. Jetzt wird's lustig, as they say in Berlin. If I have any notoriety at all in the tarot verse, it's perhaps because I seem to be the only commentator in the whole world who doesn't like 78 Degrees of Wisdom by Rachael Pollack. I came across this book relatively early in my tarot journey. Can't stand that expression. Or rather, the tarot journey, you know, since I started this channel. My husband, bless him, gave me this for Christmas. He thought I'd like it, and I thought I'd like it too. And I read it in all innocence, knowing nothing about Rachael Pollack, having no idea that this was, like, you know, the most famous, the most successful, and the most hyped tarot book in the whole Western English-speaking world. And I just thought, oh, I don't like it. I don't like it. And the more I read, the more I thought, I don't think I like it. And I was actually, you know, I ground my way through it, didn't I? You know, as you do when your husband gives you a book. And I got onto the second half, which is about the minor arcana, and I thought, it's not very good. Anyway, I know that everyone loves this book except for me. And I have released my infamous full-length review of this book, which got me a few clicks, as you'd expect. And I've mentioned it in my roundup of books I don't like. But as you're watching this video, I will briefly try to sum up my objections to this book. It is, when you look a little bit further beneath the hype, it is not only is it a very popular book, but it's also a book which is very, in a quiet way, very unpopular. it's put a lot of people off tarot, as I know, because when I did my review, my sort of thumbs down review of the book, people wrote to me and said they were so happy that I'd said that because they had picked up this book about tarot, they'd been excited about tarot cards, and they'd read it and they thought, oh, maybe I don't want to read tarot cards after all if it's that complicated, if it's that impenetrable. So what's wrong with the book? It's odd because it takes the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck as absolute gospel truth, which is also what Jodorowsky does with the Marseille, and we'll get onto Jodorowsky later. And it says that, this deck is 1000% coherent within itself. Everything, every picture, every line in this deck has meaning, and all the meanings add up. And, this deck basically contains the secret of life. And so it gets incredibly sort of nerdy, and it does these strange things, like it tells you to take the major arcana and lay it out in 3 rows of 7, forgetting the Fool, of course, because sometimes the Fool is major arcana and sometimes it isn't, depending on what we're trying to prove. And then you see these 3 rows of 7, and then you say, oh, card number 1 and card number 8 and card number 15 or whatever it is, they correspond to each other in magical, mystical ways. And I don't believe a word of it. I think that tarot was not born in that way. The first tarot decks, didn't even have 22 major arcana cards. And let's face it, there was a first tarot deck. There were playing cards, and then one day somebody sat down, maybe it was a servant of the Duke of Milan in Italy in the 1420s or something, and created a special turbo pack of cards with this suit of trumps in it. It certainly did not have 21 or 22 majors, and it certainly was not the major arcana that we know to this day. It probably had 14 majors. Certain cards just weren't there. And then tarot caught on as a craze, and then you had another set made in Florence, and you had another set made in Siena, and they were all different, and gradually it settled down over many hundreds of years into the deck that we know today. And, during those hundreds of years between the 15th century and the 20th century, the esoteric people got their mitts onto tarot and did make it esoteric. They forced it to be esoteric, and they forced it to correspond. And that was the agenda of the Golden Dawn, which is where Pamela Colman Smith comes from, and A.E. Waite. But to claim that the secrets of the universe and, the laws of matter and the ultimate truth about spirit and God and everything are contained in these 78 cards, or even in these 21 cards, we've thrown the Fool out for now, I think is just pushing it. And when you try to impose this belief on readers, I think it just makes the reader feel tired. It's very off-putting. It's basically not true, and you're basically forcing these pictures to mean certain things that they don't really mean. And ... I think I should shut up, shouldn't I? If you want to hear me rant more about 78 Degrees of Wisdom, you just have to go to my book reviews playlist, and you can hear me ranting for a good half hour. But we're on the section of this video which is Bêtes Noires, and here's a great bête noire, which you probably enjoy hearing me rant about, which is a history of the occult tarot by Ronald Decker and Michael Dummett. Well, I think the real the culprit here is Michael Dummett, who was a curmudgeonly professor who liked playing cards, but really had a bee in his bonnet and really didn't like the New Age and didn't like woo-woo, didn't like divination, didn't like spirituality, didn't like magic at all. And so he wrote 2 books about what terrible, terrible people esoteric people are, and how they're all a load of old frauds, and how it's all terribly, terribly silly. And he just goes on and 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 then on and on and on about the invention and the development of tarot cards, and how no, it's not magical, no, it's not esoteric, no, there's no connection with Kabbalah, no, there's no connection with astrology, and oh, What's more, the tarotists of history were terrible people. They cheated on their wives, they lied, they cheated, they stole. The Golden Dawn was founded on the strength of false documents. So it's like, and what's more, it's not even funny. It's these long, dense paragraphs written in Mandarin academic English, a bit like Henry James at his worst. You know, you have to hunt the thimble looking for the main verb of the sentence, because it's also high class English. You know, you have to be terribly clever to read it, but it's also a silly book because it sets out to kind of bury tarot, but it doesn't do a very good job of it, because by the time it gets to the 20th century, it's clear that the people who are into tarot are of quite a high caliber. You know, people like C.G. Jung, one of the co-founders of psychology itself, who was very into tarot cards, among other things. And so the book sort of becomes less and less and less persuasive, and you end up thinking, why did they write it? What's really interesting, having done my rant, is that the co-author is Ronald Decker. And Ronald Decker has written his own book about tarot, which is certainly favourable to the idea of divination and to the idea of, you know, being spooky and channeling and doing magic and stuff. And you get the feeling in this book that Ronald Decker was in some way tricked into involvement with this book. You know, I have an image of him chained to a typewriter and whipped by Michael Dummett and forced to write, you know, negatively about the tarot. I would love to know from Mr. Decker himself if that's the way it happened. But no, I'm a great admirer of Ronald Decker for reasons which I will make clear later on in this video. There are two books, at least, by Michael Dummett. There's this, and there's another one called A Wicked Pack of Cards. It's out of print. I considered getting hold of it, and then I thought, you know, why suffer? I picked up three, you know, Bêtes Noires books. I'll just mention this one in passing to say it's a disrecommendation. It's in my second video about tarot books I don't recommend. Its heart is probably in the right place, but I think the Four Dummies series, the Four Dummies, you know, brand, I've never particularly liked it, and I think that it wasn't a marriage made in heaven to do a Four Dummies for tarot. And just very briefly, I'll tell you why. You can do a Four Dummies if you're talking about a subject that is, in a sense, more cut and dried, like the French language, the history of England, how to use AI, how to ferment vegetables, you know, these things which are to some extent scientific and sort of contained. Tarot isn't. There is no rule book with tarot. It's not a science. It is actually a borderline irrational pursuit. It's a surrealistic thing. And so the attempt to codify it as a subject like other subjects that are taught in schools, I think is a bit doomed from the start. And if you were to pick up this book and have a look at it, you'd find out what I mean. So if you want to hear more or see more about this book, it's in my video, 7 More Tarot Books I Don't Recommend. I think we're doing quite well, don't you? I'd like to do a little section about historical tarot books. And as a sort of like a link to the last section, here is Ronald Decker's book. It's called The Esoteric Tarot, Ancient Sources Rediscovered in Hermeticism and Kabbalah. And it's got a very strange picture on the front of a man with a wasp waist. I'm not sure whether that's a real picture or whether Ronald Decker asked the AI to do him a picture. But anyway, now this, to my surprise, I was in Watkins in London. I was flicking through books on the tarot shelf, and I saw this Ronald Decker. Remembered the name from that ghastly book, and had a look at it, and I thought, this is really interesting. And so this, we see Ronald Decker with a completely different hat on, sort of as a believer, I suppose you could say, and set free from Michael Dummett's dungeons and chains and his clutches. and freed up to write a really interesting book. It's very clever and very highly researched. It's completely readable and very enjoyable, and it's packed with interesting facts that you didn't know about the origins of tarot. All I would say is that as it goes on, it gets a bit Kabbalistic for my, not exactly for my tastes, but for my agenda, because frankly my agenda is to get through life as a happy tarot reader without dealing with Kabbalah. I read the whole book and I grappled with Ronald Decker's Kabbalistic bits in this book, and I tried to kind of find them inspiring, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see the connection between the Kabbalistic elements and the tarot really in any but about 10 or 5% of the cases. I'm just blind to it. But I think if that's how you read tarot cards, then knock yourself out. Certainly the first half of the book is very cheering, and I think, well, it's very cheering if you've just read the one he wrote with Michael Dummett. But there is stuff about the invention, origins of tarot, which I think if you're interested in that, it's worth getting this book just for the first half, I would say. There is another history book coming up which sort of trumps them all, if I may use the word trumps. I think this is pretty good, this one. Now, I've got here 2 books by the lovely Robert M. Place. This is the one I recommend. It's called The Tarot, History, Symbolism and Divination. And someone here says, this may be the best book ever written on that deck of cards, decorated with mysterious images called the tarot. Now, Robert M. Place, you may or may not know, is a tarot designer, a brilliant tarot designer. I don't use his decks. They're a bit special. He's also someone who insists on introducing other elements into tarot, like he makes his decks sort of alchemical, as if to add to the confusion. But this book is a fun read. There's good writing about the origins of tarot. It's good about the Renaissance, the Neoplatonism of the Renaissance, and it kind of gives you quite a good overview as to how tarot might have been invented, the sort of person who might have invented tarot. And because Robert M. Place is an artist himself, it's very sort of artist friendly, and it makes you think of people like Leonardo da Vinci, and it makes you think to yourself, oh yes, I can imagine the sort of person in 15th century Italy who might have devised the tarot, who might have just sat down and done it. I mean, you can imagine, can't you? You can imagine someone of the stature of Leonardo da Vinci being clever enough to sit down and say, I'm going to do a turbocharged pack of cards here, because that's what they were like in that country at that time. They were clever, and they were originators, weren't they? So this is a nice book by an artist about an art piece called the tarot. It's well printed, it's well published, it's well edited, it's completely coherent, and though it's not the last word on tarot, it's a good thing to have on your shelf, and it's highly recommended, I would say. And that's a preamble to saying this, that there is another book by Robert M. Place, this one. It's a great doorstop of a book. It's called The Tarot, Magic, Alchemy, Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, 3rd edition. So it doesn't quite claim to be a book about tarot, even though it ends up being about tarot, because it ends up being a book about 2 of Robert M. Place's tarot decks, the alchemical tarot and the tarot of the sevenfold mystery. And you can see details of Robert M. Place's tarot decks on the cover there. There's a number of reasons why I don't recommend this book. I've given it a full review. It's lavishly illustrated. It's lavish. No one would complain about a lavishly illustrated. No one would say, your book is too lavishly illustrated. But what is strange about the book is that it's been printed on heavy, you could say good quality paper, rather glossy, heavy paper. And the result is that the book It weighs a ton. I would say that the same book, if printed on normal book style paper, which heaven knows was good enough for this one, which is also lavishly illustrated, I think the book could have weighed half of what it weighs. So this is one reason why it's quite a tiring book to read, because it's unwieldy. What are you going to do? You need a special lectern for it. You need a special thing to hold the book while you're reading it. And I'm not really being facetious. I think that is a problem. It feels like it was self-published. It feels like a publisher would have wagged their finger and said to Mr. Place, no, don't print it on that paper. It's not very well edited. It's quite nicely written most of the time. It's very knowledgeable, and this is clearly a topic on which that Robert M. Place is passionate about and loves and reads up about all the time. So there's a huge amount of information about the old days, the old traditions, the old religions, esoteric strands and so forth. And some of it is interesting. I found most of it not very inspiring, maybe because he covers topics that don't inspire me. I found that when he was talking about divination with cards, he was very inspiring. Yes, chapter 12, The History of Cartomancy. That's a fantastic chapter, but it's only 20 pages long, and the book itself is like 600 pages, 650 pages long. And as I say, it ends with quite a large section at the back, which is really about Robert M. Place's two decks, or two of his decks. So that's the last sort of 200 pages or so. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a funny project, and I don't really recommend it. I think it was more of a duty than a pleasure to read it. That's what I will say for now. I respect the writer and I respect the work that went into this, and I'm kind of glad I read it, but I have to say I didn't get a huge amount out of it. Now, let's just throw in a book to cheer us all up that is a super double thumbs up 5 or 10 star recommendation. This is A Cultural History of Tarot, From Entertainment to Esotericism by Helen Farley, published by Bloomsbury. But that really says it all, from entertainment to esotericism. In other words, she's clear about the origins of tarot. She's a proper academic, researching kind of person. And she doesn't sort of waste your time on speculation or obfuscation or fudging the issue or just making things up, as certain tarot writers do, mentioning no names, dreaming things up, which could be called absolute utter wicked lies, mentioning no names. But no, this is a proper professorial level book. It's short. We like short, don't we? Because we have an attention span of a flea. It's 176 pages or so, and it will tell you everything you need to know about the history of tarot. It's nicely illustrated. I can't find any illustrations today. It's fairly nicely illustrated. There. And it has notes at the back. What's interesting is that Helen Farley disagrees with some of the claims of Paul Huson. I think she disagrees with some of the claims of Decker and Dummett. And on the whole, I would trust her to be more factually accurate than any of those gentlemen. On the other hand, when you read this range of history books, you get the feeling of, okay, there's a limit. Given the evidence that we have, available to us at this point in time, there is a limit to how sure we can be about the origins of tarot. I mean, we know more about the origins of tarot now than we did in 1980 or 1990. And when we get onto Jodorowsky's book, I will have something quite severe to say about that. There's, in a sense, there's no excuse for having silly ideas about the origins of tarot, like ideas which are completely divorced from the known facts. There's no excuse for it in a world which has this book in it. You can buy it for a few quid, can't you? I don't know, 20 quid, 15 quid, 175 pages, and you can read it. And then you will know with a fair amount of certainty what probably the origins of tarot were. You can then supplement this book with books written by more esoterically minded people like the lovely Ronald Decker. And you can put them together and you can get a feeling for, okay, Helen Farley's probably got the upper hand factually, but there is room for disagreement. And she's a little bit quick to dismiss some of the esoteric claims for tarot. Well, if you read books by Ron Decker and Paul Huson, which she to some extent refutes, you get the feeling that they might be taking a slightly broader view than Helen Farley. I think what Ron Decker is saying is that although tarot was invented as a deck of playing cards, there might have been an injection of esoteric content very early on, maybe almost immediately, or maybe in the 16th century. And I think, if I remember rightly, Helen Farley is saying that there's no injection of esoteric content until the 18th century. You know, I mean, this is all splitting hairs slightly, isn't it, on the broad scale of things? But if that's your cup of tea, and I find it interesting, then, you know, great book. And I also have to say at this point that the lovely Helen Farley actually contacted me in the comments under my single video reviewing this book, and was very gracious and chatty and nice. And then, of course, I blushed because my review contained some micro criticisms of Helen Farley's work. And then that's always terribly embarrassing because you're talking to the person who you've just been sort of severe to. I couldn't have written this book. So what right do I have to split hairs over certain tiny, tiny little details? While we're on the subject of historical books, here's a book by Marcus Katz and Tally Goodwin, Secrets of the Waite-Smith Tarot. And I will, after I've mentioned this book, I'll seamlessly go on to another Marcus Katz book, which I think is much better. Marcus Katz and Tally Goodwin, but mainly Marcus Katz, is notable for having published scores of books. I mean, it seems like in the space of a few years, he just published 30 books or something about the tarot. So he obviously has a way of working which is extremely efficient and extremely quick. And he has a way of cranking out material about tarot. In my experience, it's a bit patchy. I think Tarosophy is the Marcus Katz book to read, which, even though I think it's also a bit of a bumpy ride, I found this book interesting because Marcus Katz and Tally Goodwin, they do publish, in a sense, original research material. They do go to the British Museum and look at old letters and things, and they rootle about and they find interesting new things about Pamela Colman Smith and the creation of the tarot, and they tell you about it. It's a bit unstructured and it's a bit random, and frankly, it's not a very well edited book. It's not digestible and it's not a smooth read. So it's kind of a borderline recommendation / disrecommendation. Buy if you're in the mood. If you're a crazy Pamela fan, it's not bad, and it's certainly better than some of the other Pamela books that I've mentioned in this video. Okay, here's another Marcus Katz, Tally Goodwin book from my shelves. It's called Practical Tarot Techniques, Your Essential Toolkit for Better Readings. It's a nicely produced book. It's done by Llewellyn Books. Nicely laid out, nicely edited, all very nice. I didn't find it particularly interesting, though I wouldn't exactly disrecommend it. It's probably a good primer, but I wasn't looking for a primer. I think the glory of Michael Katz is more in this book, Tarosophy. Now, this is another book which has its pitfalls. I found it strangely organised and not always easy to read, and I found it strangely unbalanced that he would go down long rabbit holes and talk about things without any sort of preparation. It feels like a collection of writings. It doesn't feel like one book at all. and you get the feeling that some of the writings originate from quite a long time ago. He talks about cassettes, using cassettes in meditations, which for me is very 20th century. And this book came out well into the 21st century. That's all fine. What I want to say is that I certainly owe Michael Katz a debt of gratitude, because he does have this very modern, very sharp, very smart understanding of what divination is. He goes in for NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and he sees tarot as a ritualistic thing, a surrealistic thing, I think an irrational thing, which is all stuff that I have always known. That for me, tarot is a way of going into a different mental state, a way of putting yourself into a different mental state, into a different belief system, so that certain beliefs and certain habits of the brain are somehow, switched off, so that other possibilities and other ways of thinking, other ways of perceiving and other ways of being in the universe can function. Now that's my belief about tarot, and Marcus Katz frames it as what he calls the oracular moment, and he sees it as a kind of ritual which will throw up its own truths, and I think that's really important, and I'm really grateful to him for that insight. For example, very occasionally I will do a reading. I'll do one of my monthly readings, or maybe even, heaven help me, one of my political readings, and I'll put it on YouTube, and there it is. And very occasionally someone will put in the comments, I disagree with Robert, I disagree with your interpretation of these cards. Didn't you know that the tower means this? No, that means that. And frankly, it kind of makes my blood boil, because apart from having an ego, which I have, and apart from being a terrible old snob and not wanting anyone to ever criticize me, that's all fine. But it does, for me, demonstrate a complete misunderstanding of what tarot reading is and what the oracular moment is. In other words, when I take tarot cards and put them down on the table and read and talk to you about what I see, firstly, I'm not claiming that's the ultimate truth. There is no ultimate truth. But what I'm doing is that I am putting myself into a certain state in which I may or may not be doing interesting things with my brain, and I may or may not be channeling, whatever channeling means. I may or may not be communicating with higher intelligences in other dimensions, whatever that means, but I'm doing something, and then I tell you what I see in the cards. Now, as far as I'm concerned, when I do a reading, that reading belongs to me. Those cards, that spread is mine. My interpretation is the only interpretation. You can look at what I'm doing with the cards and you can say, oh, I would have read those differently. But you can't tell me that I've read my own cards wrong, because the oracular moment is the oracular moment. It's just what happened. And, the people receiving the oracular moment can take it or leave it. But I don't think, take it or leave it, but you better believe it. I don't think it makes any logical sense to disagree with a tarot reader, because we're not in the realms of the sciences. Okay, so I'm grateful to Marcus Katz, in a sense, for backing me up on this one. It is an oracular moment. And this is why if you make a mistake, an obvious mistake during a tarot reading, that is also part of the oracular moment. And then you just have to fight to make sense of what happened. You have to fight to look for meaning in what happened. But you cannot just collapse and go to pieces and say, oh, I got it wrong. There is no wrong, I'm afraid to say. Pushing ahead, pressing on, as Julian Clary would say. He had a very rude joke about pressing on, but I won't tell you what it is. Here we have Tarot Spreads by Barbara Moore, and I recommend it. You're only as good as your spread. I mean, I think as we settle down as tarot readers, we settle down into 2 or 3 spreads, which we have in our repertoire. And we use certain spreads in certain years. We get bored with spreads. We look for other spreads. One of the nice things about this book is that it's got 100 spreads in it or something, and they're all pretty interesting. And also Barbara Moore says, invent your own spreads. And I think if you do a lot of tarot reading, you will end up inventing your own spreads, because you'll realize how interesting the whole thing is, and you will need to invent your own spreads. Do I need to turn the light on? So yeah, Tarot Spreads by Barbara Moore, layouts and techniques to empower your readings. And, I use these. They're great. Nice book. Well, this one, ladies and gentlemen, is a bit of an oddity, and it comes from the early days of my research, period. I was reading tarot without researching it for 40 years, and then I started this channel and I thought, I better find out what I'm talking about. So I've been researching for the past 5 years. And this is one of my early purchases. I was very impressed. It's called Genius of Tarot, A Guide to Divination with the Tarot, and it's by Vincent Petisci. Very, very modest. I mean, it's a self-published book, and, the guy's put his name in the bottom left corner, in little black letters that you can't really read. Very, very modest. I was impressed by Vincent Petisci because I saw him on YouTube, and he was explaining Tarot de Marseille techniques. And in this book, he's more talking about RWS. I think I don't really recommend this book, but in a sense, I do recommend Vincent Petisci because he's very fabulous and he's a great joy to watch on YouTube. It's just, he's an international treasure, isn't he? He's marvelous. He has a slightly sort of Marseille kind of way of reading the RWS, which I completely disagree with, ladies and gentlemen. Don't like it. I find it too conceptual and too simplistic, and not at all the sort of system that I could use, or that I would want to use for my practice. But on the other hand, if you do come across a copy of this book, in a secondhand bookshop, I think his first chapter's quite nice. His first couple of chapters, introducing the tarot and how tarot works. He's called the book Genius of Tarot because he has this theory that the tarot makes you think like a genius, basically, by which he means that it's a bit like what I was saying about this. It enables your brain to sort of work in a slightly expanded way, on a slightly higher and slightly more exciting way than usual. He's clearly a powerful and clever tarot reader, but I don't recommend the book. And last in this little clutch of books, we have Tarot Beyond the Basics by Anthony Louis. I bought this book when I was sort of desperately looking around for any intelligent writing on the subject of the court cards. I hear the bells. Why? What time is it? So let's just carry on with the church bells in the background. Anthony Louis, in one of my videos I called him a Jungian, and then a real Jungian, or an Anthony Louis fan, wrote in the comments, he's not a Jungian. He's not. Well, okay, but he writes a bit like a Jungian. He's very into elements, and he says the elemental personalities of the court cards. He's quite a good writer, and a lot of this book is readable, but I don't really recommend it. I think it's very cerebral. It's so cerebral I can hardly even bear to tell you about it. He says he's talking about elements here. The wet, dry spectrum among the court cards, the dry, cold, earthy pages and princesses, the hot, dry, fiery knights, the wet, hot, airy princes. So it's all about wet, dry, hot, cold, then elements. And I'm sorry, this kind of highly structured, cerebral, systematic attempt to understand the tarot, I find a great turn-off, and it just makes me lose the will to live. I'm being a bit hard on it because I have taken nice things from this book, but on the whole, I think I kind of am not really on the same wavelength as this writer. So I think before I say anything more, I should button my lip, shouldn't I? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the last section. I've got 2 kind of thumbs down and 1 thumbs up book. Jodorowsky, a famous book. We have Alejandro Jodorowsky and Marianne Costa, The Way of Tarot, the Spiritual Teacher in the Cards. Well, I've given this a full review. I'm not a fan. I admire Jodorowsky on one level, which is that he believes in tarot reading as a serious business. He believes it has a psychological aspect, and he believes that psychological aspect should be taken very seriously, and that tarot readings should be taken very seriously. And I think who would argue with that? Okay, my Italian friend Jacopo, who's a tarotist, tells me that the book was a big major hit in Italy, and it seemed to come across as a corrective to a certain kind of trashy tarot reading done by people on TV, people like me, I suppose, dressing up in funny outfits and making it all a bit of a showbiz thing. And I think he thought that tarot had become trashy. And so this is a very serious book. But it's to do with the fact that he, with the help of one of the heirs to the Tarot de Marseille printers, he created a restored version of the Tarot de Marseille. And then, having created this, he then, in the course of this book, tells you how the secrets of the universe are contained within his version of the Tarot de Marseille. And he's not claimed that he invented the secrets of the universe. This is why it's not really coherent. He's claiming that they were there from the creation of tarot. And he sort of scrubbed up the Tarot de Marseille, and now he can fully reveal, having scrubbed it up and redrawn bits of it, he can now fully reveal what the secrets of the tarot are. And I think this is, I think there's a lot of gaslighting in this. I think he might even know that a lot of what he's saying isn't true. But whether he knows it or not, it's extremely inaccurate. He insists that tarot was created around the year 1000, so he's 400 years out on that. He insists it was created in France, so he's a few hundred kilometres wrong in that respect. And he also insists that the English, God help us, created the playing cards by taking the tarot pack and removing all the nice major arcana, which can't be true, can it, ladies and gentlemen, because the playing cards existed before the tarot cards. So it's not really a book that you can take seriously if you've read around tarot. You could just choose to just take it on board for fun, I mean, it's very ecstatically written. It's very over-the-top written, not originally written in English, which might be part of the problem. I don't find it an easy read. I find it an amusing read sometimes. It's a bit psychedelic, isn't it? It's a bit like, and I hesitate to fling these accusations, but it's a bit like a marijuana trip some of the time. Not necessarily a bad thing, but that's what it's a bit like. So no, there's very, very little in this book that I can take remotely seriously. There's a very good chapter at the end. I mean, this is a very interesting, intelligent, cultured person writing this book, which is why it's so difficult to talk about it. There's a very good bit at the end. It's the last 12 pages of the book. It's called Conclusion. And so my advice to anyone with regard to this book is, if you ever see it on the shelf of a tarot bookshop, an esoteric bookshop, just sit in the shop, just make yourself comfortable, sit down and read the last 12 pages, because that's really the only good stuff in this book, and it's very good. So there you go, Alejandro Jodorowsky. Jodorowsky fans, please forgive me for not being a believer. I'm not a believer, but I think that Jodorowsky's such a tricky person anyway. He probably wouldn't even particularly object to my comments. I think he knows he's a trickster, and I think he himself takes his own book with a pinch of salt. Penultimately, 36 Secrets by Susan Chang. Not as annoying as Rachael Pollack's 78 Degrees of Wisdom, but in some respects similar. I mean, I don't hate this book. I quite like it in parts, but I just disagree with the whole premise. The premise is that there are 36 decans in the horoscope, and each of these decan, according to the Golden Dawn, corresponds to one of the pip cards. So that's numbers 2 to 10 of the 4 suits. So that's 9 times 4 is 36. So, you know, you have 10 of Pentacles is the 3rd decan of Virgo. The 6 of Wands is the 2nd decan of Leo. And some of the time it kind of works, and some of the time it doesn't. And it's got this Rachael Pollacky thing of reading a huge amount into the tiniest details of Pamela's drawings, which incidentally, this happens as well in this book, but in this case, it's the Marseille tarot that he's referring to, which is in a sense even more brain frying. But so this is quite a jolly book, but I just don't accept the premise. I think, you know, the Golden Dawn did want the pip cards to correspond to the 36 decans, and sometimes they do, but that particular part of history in which tarot and astrology were sort of jammed together was a messy moment, and the Golden Dawn's rectification of the tarot was a messy affair and not an entirely coherent one. And so when you get a writer like T. Susan Chang writing a book, a very meticulous book, which wants it all to not be messy and wants it all to be coherent, 100% coherent, the result, I think, is a book that doesn't really entirely make sense. Some of it makes sense and some of it just doesn't. And let's finish up on a positive note. Taschen. We love Taschen, don't we? We love Taschen. Taschen's a lovely, lovely publishing firm in Germany, I must say. I have the German version. This is a coffee table book. Try not to obscure my microphone. About tarot design. So it's just a visual delight. Open it on any page and you'll be happy. It's lovely, lovely production. Taschen's a great publisher. Sure, it's heavy, but it's worth it. And it's not really a book you want to read from cover to cover. It's a book you flip through in those idle moments. It's just eye candy, really. And it's very nicely curated. You know, there are hundreds and thousands of tarot decks in the world, and I think it's really mostly concentrating on tarot decks up to the year 2000, but it slips in a couple of 21st century decks as well. It's got a good essay at the beginning about the origins of tarot. Well, a couple of good essays. And it's got a very, very good page which gives us a timeline in the development of tarot from the pre-tarot times in the 13th century right through to the present day. So it's just like little tiny, tiny potted history, just a sentence here and a sentence there with dates from 13th century right through to the 21st century. And that's a really, really nice bit of work. And it's also, on top of that, it's got chapters about the history of tarot design, you know, just gorgeous. So, yeah, this is a classic Christmas present for the tarotiste in your life. So, ladies and jelly spoons, that was my rompy, account of all the tarot books I have. I should probably now go into my room and find out one that I forgot about. But that'll have to do because that was 31 books. I now need a good cup of tea, don't I? My name's Robert Farrer, this is Tea and Tarot, and I'll be back next week with more of this stuff. Bye.